Hello and welcome to week number 4 of the Watching and Waiting podcast. I am Rachel Parfinchuk, Director of Music Ministries here at Powell United Methodist Church.
And I'm Kim LaRue, the Director of Adult Ministries at Powell United Methodist Church, a colleague of Rachel's. We're glad to be doing this together. And this week, our fourth week of Advent, we're going to talk about another Advent hymn that you may be familiar with, but we don't sing it very often, and that is In the Bleak Midwinter. So it's such a great, again, another one of my favorite hymns. It's a great, both metaphoric and scriptural hymn that kind of takes us through the story, the Christmas story that we are familiar with. And so the first verse talks about this bleak midwinter. Frosty wind made moan, earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone, and creates all of these cold and austere kind of images that speak to the time of year that we are in this watching and waiting time. And the poet who wrote these words, Christina Rossetti, was in England, and so this makes sense in her context that this would be her experience. Of course, we know that in Israel, in Palestine, it would have been very different. So this is kind of a metaphoric experience, as well as the reality of some of parts of the world during Advent. So it's just a really interesting way to start an Advent hymn, not necessarily based in the reality of where Jesus was born, but the reality of our own experience and the reality of our own hearts. And then the hymn goes on to talk about the rest of the Christmas story. It talks about Mary and Joseph's journey, the angels announcing to the shepherds. It talks about the ox and the ass and the lambs, the shepherds, and then finally kind of a summation of all of them had different things to give, and the question then is, what do we have to give?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is really kind of a unique kind of contrast even from the ones that we've talked about previously in our series, because now we're talking about this familiar Advent story. And one thing in particular that I do want to note about this is that we are talking specifically about the Gustav Holst version of this hymn. And now that's important because this is not the only version of In the Bleak Midwinter that exists. There is another by Harold Dark, and that is a completely different melody, a completely different arrangement, but the text is the same. So this is just another kind of a contrast to what we had before with our O Come, O Come Emmanuel, where the melody stays the same, but perhaps there are a few different translations. And In the Bleak Midwinter here is a representation of the text being the forefront, the story being the forefront, but the music changes between the different versions.
So that's really interesting. And Gustav Holst sounds kind of familiar.
Yes, so he is very famous for his orchestral work, The Planets. So if you are familiar with that work, it is kind of interesting to think about how that piece of music is just completely different from this piece of music, and just wondering what might have drawn Holst to compose such different music. I don't know, but it is definitely a really cool connection.
Yes, definitely. So what else about the music should we look at or listen to as we're thinking about this hymn, Rachel?
One thing that sticks out to me, like you mentioned earlier, we have some rather unpleasant imagery, talking about bleak midwinter and, the waters frozen like a stone. All of these things sound not ideal, and musically, we're in a major key, which we don't normally associate major keys with this kind of more negative, maybe not negative, but just less desirable imagery. So yeah, that kind of wondering why might that be, and we can kind of think about that as well.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting. So I wonder if often, I think, unless we take time to reflect on things, I think sometimes we just take them at the surface level, but if we kind of go down to the next level, what might that have meant? why is that the case? And I'm wondering if maybe part of, at least my experience of this song and my own life, is that God is always under the surface, even if I'm not noticing God. And God is always involved, even when it's bleak. And sometimes I turn to God more often when I feel like everything is dark or all of the water has turned to stone. And my experience is that God is in the middle of all of that anyway. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's one aspect of why that might have been done that way. But again, like you've talked about, at least to me before, is that often art and music are things that appeal to us or speak to us in a way that may not have been the original intention, but it's what we're seeing or hearing, right?
Yeah, it's totally authentic. I mean, we can talk about, there are things that we know for fact, and there are things that we don't know for fact, especially with these pieces of music that are just so old and been carried in the tradition. And the reality is that, it is important to be interested in the history and the truth behind it, but as listeners, as people who are receiving this music, whatever you receive is right, is correct. This is art, and this is meant to be a reflection, and meant to be something that's very personal. So this is just a piece of music that I find to be, absolutely an amazing gift to us, that we have things like this.
Yes. Another thing that I've noticed, particularly in this hymn, or at least this time we're going to talk about this piece of it, is that often we learn about faith through music mm-hmm. before we are able to take a Bible study or dig into scripture in any kind of deep way. Same thing with stained glass windows. Those are meant to teach us. And so are our hymns and our music, that they were intended for us to learn something. And that's why this one that talks about that whole journey from when Joseph is called to report in to the Roman government, all the way through those gathered around the stable observing the birth of Jesus. That's why this is really important, is that we've learned some of those characters and some of the responses of them to this story and how powerful it was to them. So I'm really thankful that these exist, that we have learned them through the ages, and they teach us along the way.
Yeah, it's funny that as you say that, I think back to myself. Rachel, what's the first song you ever learned in church? Jesus Loves Me. Think about it. These songs, they get into your heart, they get into your soul, and the music speaks.
And what a good one to learn first.
I know, right?
Is there anything else musically that we should pay attention to here, or other things that you've observed that you want to invite us to think about?
Well, with this one, so it's strophic, which means that each verse is the exact same melody in harmony the whole time. So it's interesting that, as we're going through the story and things are changing, our music is actually staying the same. Okay. So the answer to why that's the case, I don't know. But I imagine that we can think about that as being, this cornerstone of God and Jesus, even though, the story is, continuously changing and what is going to happen, we don't know, through each verse. Well, we do know, but, but this music is, the constant melody that always comes back and is the same, is, this comfort knowing that God will always be there. So I think that's a really interesting piece about that. And so then talking about how that is different from the other version of In the Bleak Midwinter that I mentioned earlier, the other version, which is not in our hymnal, is completely different. It's accompanied and it's through composed. So when I say through composed, what I mean is the music is continuously changing throughout. So it's not just an exact repetition of the harmony and melodies, but as we move through, the harmony changes and even the melody changes too as well with each verse. So that way of telling the story is completely different. So, just wondering why these changes are made. And so even if you hear the same story, the same text, when you're listening to the two different versions, you could completely get something totally different out of it.
Which reminds me of when we tell our own stories, we may have been in the same room at the same time, the same thing happening. Mm-hmm. And as we tell the stories, they might sound different. But it's because of our experience and our things that have shaped us mm-hmm. that help us tell the story in our own way. And so that's really powerful.
Yeah, and I think that actually really connects with something that you were saying to me earlier about your remembering of the text. What can I give him? And I don't know if you want to kind of expand on that a little.
Yeah, so the last verse of this is really powerful to me. What can I give him, poor as I am? This has just come out of talking about the shepherds and those experiences with the angels announcing to the shepherds. The verse continues, if I were a shepherd, I would bring a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what can I give him? Give him my heart. That's the way I've sung it for every year up until this one. And when Rachel and I started working on this, I was like, wait a minute, that's not what it says. So the verse starts out with, what can I give him, poor as I am? But it ends with a one-word difference than what I thought. It ends with, yet what I give him my heart. What can I give him? As opposed to another question at the end sounding like I'm empty and I have nothing to give. What it does is it claims what we do have, what gifts we do have, that God has empowered us with gifts that we can give. And so the verse ends with, yet what I give him my heart. So it's a powerful empowerment of who I am and that I have been gifted with things to give. And the interesting thing is that you also have gifts, right? That might not look like my gifts, but we're all gifted. And so this affirmation of who God is in us and what we can give back is really important in this hymn.
Yeah, I think it's so personal, talking about these differences and just the way you receive it and what you have to give. It's very personal.
The other thing that we were thinking about is the succession of the podcasts that we've done, and you were thinking about how they all connect. So I think you should talk about that.
Yeah, so I kind of noticed, I think that the order we have done these podcasts and just worked really nicely because we started out talking about Gabriel's message, which is, of course, when we're first learning from Gabriel about, the coming of Jesus. So that's what really kicks the story of the watching and waiting off. Then after we moved from Gabriel's message, we moved to O Come, O Come, Emmanuel, which gives us kind of a greater context of what Gabriel's message actually means for the world. So we move from that into Jesus Christ the apple tree, where now we're talking about, okay, what is the reality of who is Jesus, who is coming to us? So now we have this reality of who Jesus is. And then we end here with In the Bleak Midwinter that tells the story that we are so familiar with. But not only do we have the words that we're familiar with and comfortable with, but now we've come from this place, this journey from these past 3 weeks to give us even some more context beyond that.
And it sends us out to do the things that God has gifted us to do, and that we can claim those and be empowered to take that, yet what I give him my heart.
Absolutely.
So this is a podcast that was supported by and encouraged by Powell United Methodist Church, and we hope that you've been able to listen to all of them. But if you haven't, go back and listen to anything you missed, because they were fun to put together, and it's a great addition to your Advent season listening. So we hope that you have a Merry Christmas and enjoy this season as you celebrate with family and friends, maybe in a new way, but in a meaningful way.
Thank you so much for listening, and we're so glad to have you a part of our community.